Hello there, and welcome to the Poppycock Podcast, where the topics don't matter and we're not experts. Today I'm joined by my Red Queen, my wife. Hello.
Hello.
So today what we're talking about is kind of important to a lot of people. It's Star Wars. Pretty big franchise, pretty big outreach, a lot of mediums. But something that I just finished doing was watching the big behind-the-scenes thing that Star Wars does. It's a Disney Plus series, and they show interviews with the directors and the people who do the score and all the actors about how they made it. And it got me thinking about how people seem to really universally seem to like Clone Wars and, to an extension, Rebels, and especially The Mandalorian, whereas the new sequel trilogy felt, it was less universally accepted by Star Wars fans. And I know that you yourself are not the biggest sequel movie fan.
Not at all.
And I've accepted it for what it is, and I just remind myself that it's a story about space wizards for children, and there's no reason to really get upset over it, even though it does frustrate me because something that Dave Filoni said whenever he was discussing The Mandalorian is that he pitched the characters in the show as if your big brother came and he took all the cool toys and you had all the weird background characters and you managed to get like one Boba Fett toy and you could just repaint it, and so that was the only cool character you had, and so they had to make each of those other dumb characters cool, and that's why you have all those weird background characters from stuff and like toys that no one wanted. And I think that almost made them more creative and better, because when they were making the sequels they obviously had pretty much open reign to do whatever they wanted, and it just went all over the place and felt kind of messy. And Sam Witwer, who is like half of Star Wars at this point, like he plays Darth Maul, several stormtroopers, Emperor Palpatine, and God knows how many other people, he said that The Last Jedi felt like a movie made by someone who had seen the movies but hadn't done their homework yet, and so you can't deconstruct something until you know how it's constructed. And I was like, wow, Sam Witwer, I'm glad that you trust your employment well enough to speak out against those movies. But it did feel true. And so I was sort of wondering, to you, like what makes Star Wars feel like Star Wars, and what, instead of being negative, like why did The Last Jedi and all these other movies not make you happy? Like what was it that they didn't have that made you happy by what is in the Star Wars that you do like?
Well, I think you have to kind of go back and look that, the originals are the originals, which are now 4, 5, and 6, and you can't replace them, you can't redo them. It's just, those are the originals, those are sacred ground, you don't touch it. And I think the people accept the prequels, and I like the prequels because it gives an explanation as to what happens. Because even as a kid, I remember thinking, like, where are the other Jedi? Why is, Yoda hiding? Why is Obi-Wan hiding? Why is Luke the last Jedi? Why is it the Return of the Jedi? Where did they go? And being able to go back and see, have an explanation as to why they do what they do and who they were and how they became so lost and destroyed and how the Empire came to be was more acceptable. And that's why I really like it. You get to see how they were in their prime. It's kind of like 4, 5, and 6 were kind of like, your grandparents telling you a story of back in the day, and then the prequels are being able to see like a movie of back in the day.
Yeah.
And then, Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, it wraps up at the end. Yay, everything is great. And then it was like, hey, what if we turn around and redo a story similar to this, put a twist on it, and try to revive it? It's dead. That thing coded. It was a code blue. It was dead. Stop.
For people who don't work in the medical field, that means someone who's dead or dying.
Yeah. Someone, it was gone. It's dead. There's stop trying to revive it. It's gone. And it's a new generation of people. So, if you're someone who you didn't grow up with Star Wars and you were introduced to it, I think people are more accepted, by it. But I just can't like it. There's no way for me to like this.
Do you like the Force Awakens? So I think The Rise of Skywalker, working backwards, is the best probably that it could be given the time frame they had to work on it and what happened in The Last Jedi. I think The Last Jedi was made well, but it, like, the way characters get from A to B is well done, but the directions, it's like driving in a very nice car on very nice roads to very nice places, but the route you took from A to B doesn't make any sense. and it's completely sort of off the beaten path of where you said you were going originally. And I think The Force Awakens is as good a movie as the originals. I think it's a love letter to the original movies. Hang on one second, because like I hold The Force Awakens on the same level as the previous movies that came before it, and even Rogue One. But I do not hold the final two of the trilogy that way. And you seem to think that you know why it's like awkward and it doesn't quite fit, or the rest of the sequels, that is.
Well, I think the way they did the timeline, if you look in 1 through 6, is they're showing that years or months have gaps. For
in between
instance,
the movies?
In between the movies.
Yeah.
So Phantom Menace, he's a child, then he's a teenager.
He's like a young adult.
And then he's a young adult. So there's like, 4 or 5 years, and there's like 2 years, and there's, a couple years between it. Even in 4, 5, and 6, it's supposed to be several months that take place between the movies. However, if you look at the new 3, if you look at it, a lot of them are ending days, just days before, except for, well, even then, the last one, episode 9, it's like, oh, it's been a few weeks, it's
I think it was a year or two that they said. I don't remember, but it wasn't. That was probably my biggest complaint about Kylo Ren, is like the First Order, is that in episode 4, it like you immediately feel like the Empire has been around and the Rebellion has been around for a minute, and they've been doing this dance for a while. And in episode 1, you get the feeling that these trade negotiations have been tricky for a while. And in The Force Awakens, it's just like, okay, I guess this is happening. And Kylo Ren is so young, there isn't really a legacy of him doing things. There's no like extra story or implied, sort of fear or establishment. We're just dropped in and we're sort of told, it's just like the first ones again, and we don't really see. It doesn't feel like the world has been in this struggle for a long time.
It doesn't feel like there's a story that's been taking place, and you're just now hearing of it. Darth Vader, they imply, had been around for a long time.
Yeah.
If you've watched the Star Wars Rebels animated series, in the first season, they say it had been 10 years because there is a holiday called Empire Day, where it had been actually, I think it was 13 years, because the child that becomes Ezra, that is Ezra the character, his like 13th or 14th birthday is on Empire Day. He was born on Empire Day. So they imply he's been around for almost 15 years.
However old Luke and Leia are, that's about as long as the Empire was around before that. And that means, and we see at the end of episode 3 that Darth Vader is already active, so he has, around 18 years before we even start the movies of being scary and having stories.
I don't think they even say how long Kylo Ren had been around, but they kind of imply that he's a newbie.
In the comics as well, because I've read a couple of them, it's his turn to the dark side was, I think, within 5 years of the first movie, so at most you have 5 years of him being an awkward, angry teenager.
And even then, they don't actually put him in charge of anything.
Yeah, he never feels like he actually wields power, which is a shame. Yeah, but he is a very cool character. Adam Driver is a great actor in the role.
He is, but the way they portray Kylo Ren, honestly, in the first one is so awkward. He's kind of like, he almost feels like someone's kid, like you're waiting for Darth Vader to come up behind him and be the one really force choking him, the person, while Kylo Ren's thinking, I did it!
It feels actually, it feels like Kylo Ren, the character, starts off in the same place as like Anakin did around episode 2 or 3, and then he immediately jumps to the crisis of whether or not he will be evil that Darth Vader takes like 25 years to get to, and he never has like that movie or whatever where he is at the top of his game, and he's that character that you don't want to be stuck in that hallway like in Rogue One. You don't want to be those rebels stuck there while he's just slaughtering you, like, almost for fun.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the opening scene of the 4th movie when Darth Vader boards Leia's ship, and you look at the opening scene of episode 7 where he lands on the planet, you look at the difference between the way Darth Vader holds himself and the way Kylo Ren is. I would say Darth Vader reminds me a little bit of Count Dooku. With he just walks in and you immediately are like, oh snap.
He has a presence.
Yeah, you just feel the fear through his presence, and you know, if when you see him, you know your life is over. When you see Kylo Ren, you're kind of like, this kid.
So I have a question that I've sort of been chewing this over, and I think really the only way to tell is in like the next 10 or 20 years. Because when the prequels came out, there were a lot of people who grew up on the original trilogy who said, this is dumb, Jar Jar Binks is dumb, CGI is dumb, Anakin is not a good character, and they didn't like it. And then the people who grew up on it now are like, we love it. And even the people who were against it have sort of warmed up because of the Clone Wars and the supplementary books and TV series. Do you think that the sequel trilogy in the next 10 years, there are going to be kids that this is their prequels where they're like, I really liked Kylo Ren, he was my Anakin, I grew up and I was a teenager when he was a teenager, so I knew where he was coming from, and we'll have like cartoons and stuff that build out that era?
Honestly, I don't think so.
Why not?
I don't think so because a lot of people, when you talk to them, when they say they've accepted the prequels, it's because they like the fact that it connects and it tells the story of where it answers a bunch of questions you had watching 4, 5, and 6, and they're like, hey, you know, that is the childhood. You know, like I said before, this is 4, 5, and 6 is the adult, and the prequels is the childhood of the adults, and you get to see the whole thing. This is just kind of like the awkward uncle of the story that you don't know about. You know, it's just the awkward uncle of the story. It's no longer the parents' legacy. It's the awkward uncle because they don't have anything else to do.
Well, see, I don't have an issue with the legacy. I see both sides of loving and hating each segment of Star Wars, because I think that you're with me on this, that even Solo, I have a blast. Every time I watch Solo, I like it more.
Yeah, but it's part of the originals.
I know,
it tells where he came from. That's his background
I know,
story.
but here's the thing, is that whenever I look at the sequels, I see the issue, like Rey is... Whenever you look at the original cast, there's the pilot, there's the princess, who's also a politician, and she's smart, and you got the farm boy, who's on the hero's journey. That's a very classical fantasy story. And with Rey, you kind of have all those characters. She's some form of royalty, as we find out. She's the farm character who's on a hero's journey. She's the pilot, she's the mechanic, she's all those characters, and you don't really need the other ones. Whereas if she sucked at some of those skills, it feels almost like they wanted to make this interesting character, and they forgot that characters are relatable and interesting, and the ensemble cast has something to do when that one character isn't good at everything. Because Finn, who is an incredible character, and Poe, who is an incredible character, both of them are irrelevant for most of the trilogy because you already have a pilot who's also a Jedi, who is also fighting the First Order, who is also brave and willing to do stuff, and that sort of makes these other incredible characters. It'd be like if Han Solo and Chewbacca and all them were just like a B and C plot in the original trilogy, which, you know, thankfully they aren't. But at the same time, pretty much every scene with Adam Driver in it, that I could watch those as a supercut. I think the biggest thing is that his incredible acting kind of hides the weaknesses of his character's writing, where he is sort of a whiny boy who you do sort of realize he matures throughout the movies. But I think Adam Driver is just that type of intelligent actor who he's playing a character younger than him, so he can sort of tap into like that young, awkward, you don't understand the world, but you want to make it make sense to you. And then he can sort of play through his mind, and he pulls on like that military experience of the frustration and the intensity, and he kills it every time. But at the same time, it just never feels quite the same, and I can't put my finger on it. Yes, beautiful girl across from me.
The other reason I think, you know, 7, 8, and 9 are kind of the way they are is they basically took the stories of 1 through 6, compressed it into 3 movies.
Yeah.
They took all of it and just threw it into 3 movies. They took the plot of the rise and fall and turn of good and bad and blah, blah, blah. And it's a lot that goes on. And don't get me started on episode 8 and how, like, an hour and a half of it is just useless, like, footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't even. I mean, even the original cast members, there's a lot of them that even when they came back, when their characters were killed off, they fell on their knees and thanked God because they did not want to be a part of that. They were there for the check. They did not care.
I mean, Harrison Ford didn't even, like, get a haircut or shave for his final scene in episode 9. And he's such a good actor, it still had the emotional impact. But you could tell he was like, all right, I'm here for the paycheck. I'll stand over here and talk to Adam.
I mean, even, Mark Hamill said that he didn't like the movies. He didn't want to be in the movies.
But he was professional. He was like, now that I've said that I don't like this, I'm going to do my best to make your version of this story work. Which I respect that immensely, that he was I don't like this. I feel like that was
almost like the director being like, you can't say that about my movies. Like, fine, whatever.
Well, no, he was pretty open about it, even beforehand, but he was just like, I'm the actor, and my version of what the character gets to do is not, I'm not the writer, I'm just the guy who gets to play him, which I can tell he was probably upset because he's waited, 30 years to come back to play this character that is like the epitome of the hero, and he's this broken shamble of a man.
Well, see, if they had listened to what their audience wanted when they said, hey, we're going to make a Star Wars film, if they had actually listened, someone took a survey on Twitter to see who wanted to see what done, and 80% of the votes said they would have rather had something from the old Republic, as things that are now considered legend and not canon anymore. Go way back to the old Republic, like the games, where they had, before the rule of two with the Sith, back when there was an entire Sith, temple, and they had a Sith temple, and there was the Jedi temple, and the back and forth, and the fall of Mandalore, the original. Go back 1,000 years. Go back. They mention it in Star Wars Clone Wars animated series. The Citadel was built by the Sith to capture and torture and kill Jedi. If a Jedi went there, you were not being rescued. You were gone. Bye. See you later. Yeah. Hope you have a great life. I'll tell Frank you said hi. I mean, you were dead if you went to the Citadel.
Well, can you imagine if instead of... Because I think J.J. Abrams is incredible. I know that a lot of people don't like him, but I think he did great with the first one. I think he did the best he could with the third in the trilogy, and he successfully relaunched Star Trek in a way that was respectful to the past while allowing new fans to come in. He did that with two franchises, which is incredible. But could you imagine if people who, now that we've seen it, that Dave Filoni, who did Avatar: The Last Airbender before he came on to Clone Wars, he did some work on Rebels, and now him and Favreau have done The Mandalorian, which is pretty universally praised as being like a return to form of Star Wars. Imagine if they'd gone to those two and said, you have as much time as you want to write a sequel trilogy. We just need our Disney-fied trilogy to get our money's worth out of this huge purchase from Lucas. Go ahead and you write it. Can you imagine the level of quality and how much fans would have rejoiced? Or do you think that no matter what came next, fans were going to sort of push against it for being new?
I think some of them would have pushed against it, but after seeing what he did with the Star Wars Clone Wars animated series and so many people loving
so good.
I think, it would have been actually I think a lot more people would have accepted it. I think they might have done a better job. I think there was just such a huge time gap and so little explanation of where anything even came from, and such a poor excuses made up for how things became things.
And they didn't even plan out the trilogy, which is
think about
shocking.
It took 3 movies and 7 seasons now of Star Wars Clone Wars animated series for Palpatine to take over and turn the Republic into an empire. And you're telling me that out of nowhere some rando takes the New Republic and turns it into the First Order? Come on.
Snoke was never even really a compelling... He wasn't wasn't interesting, and visually he wasn't that interesting, and the mystery of him was completely, giant air quotes, subverted, which I don't want a subverted plot, I just want a good story.
I know, but I mean, they didn't... You have to think, there was such an elaborate plan to take over it, and you would think after that, they're like, all right, we're going to make sure we're twice as smart now. Instead, that was just the easiest, saddest takeover ever. It was okay, it sounded like they didn't even have to try. They're like, okay, guys, we're shutting down the New Republic and starting a thing called, the First Order, and we're going to build a new Death Star thingy that's bigger because we can, and yeah.
Well, something that really bothers me, though, is the fact that, there's stories and, books and comics that take place in between, the original trilogy and the new trilogy where they're as soon as a rival politician outed that Princess Leia's dad was essentially Space Hitler and he was responsible for genocide, she was pretty much discredited and no one wanted to listen to her, and so that put her New Republic on its heels. It wasn't as prominent, and there was a lot of chaos, as we've seen in The Mandalorian, where just like in real life, when a government is upheaved, there's a power vacuum, and it can take a while for anything stable to form, if one ever really does form. And oftentimes, another form of what was undone eventually crawls its way back into that seat of power, for better or for worse. So it's it follows a lot of logic and there's a lot of good ideas. I feel like it was just the implementation of it that just didn't stick the landing for some reason, some way, somehow. And I don't know, I don't want to just keep talking about like the weird hollow feeling of that, but I want to almost like segue by saying that it's interesting that in the episode of The Mandalorian where they do the heist and the Mando gets betrayed, but he still pulls it all off, and he puts Bill Burr in prison with that devil monster and his ex-girlfriend. Not only does it have a fun cameo by Matt Lanter, who voices Anakin Skywalker as the New Republic ship human pilot guy who's sort of overlooking the prison system, but the 3 ace pilots that come in and they blow up that space station at the end are 3 of the directors. There's Dave Filoni, and then it was Rick and Deborah, who I think them and Dave Filoni, who directed that episode, those are all the directors aside from Taika Waititi, who's the Thor Ragnarok, and he's IG. I never remember 11 and 88. They're double of the same digit. That always throws me off. But he's the IG unit of The Mandalorian. And Dave Filoni and all of them, they said that they didn't even have a cockpit, so the X-Wing that sits in the Star Wars Celebration location in California, they took that and they flew it, or they trained it or flew it over to where they were filming. They filmed all the cockpit scenes in that cockpit. That's the prop that's sitting out there. And whenever they were like, hey, Dave and all you guys, you're going to cameo as X-Wing pilots, Favreau had noticed that the Star Wars actors in the 70s, they weren't very energetic or happy about what they were doing. They're like, all right, and we're coming up on that. Okay. And so they're like, just look disinterested and wear this cheap costume, because that's how it looked in the 70s. And when you see it on screen, it does look like a cheap costume, and they look disinterested but cool at the same time. And it has that weird Star Wars DNA that you could try to replicate it, but we like Star Wars. And in the 70s, when George was cooking this up, no one knew what it was. So these actors are like, okay, I had to shave my sideburns for this. And I look at The Mandalorian, I look at Clone Wars, and I see they aren't just replicating what already exists. They're looking at samurai films and gunslinger films that George looked at, and they're reverse engineering to then create stuff that feels the same in a new way. And I have no idea why they are not in total complete control over the tone and the style of Star Wars now, because they clearly have a grip on it that I would say almost rivals George Lucas, because George likes to do things like trade negotiation, mini-series arcs in a cartoon meant for children, and kids don't care about banking clans. So I think it's almost like now Dave and John already have like almost a better take on what Star Wars has evolved into, because it's not quite what George wanted initially. It evolved on screen and with 20th Century Fox intervention and then Disney, and now they know how to replicate that beast consistently, and it's amazing. Mm-hmm. But now they have like Boba Fett and Ahsoka. What's your opinion on the difference in between, like, because you have Rogue One and Solo that still feel like Star Wars, and you have the sequels that don't? I guess, what to you is Star Wars? When you think of Star Wars, what is that thing that makes you want to go back and read it and watch it and just, you love it?
It's basically the story. It's a complete story. It's a complete history story. It's kind of like when you are reading in history, like in high school or in college, and they say, okay, we're going to read about World War II. You know, it's from here to here, and it was started here because of this, and it ended here because of this. You know, the world existed beforehand, and you know the world continues to exist afterwards. When you say Star Wars, I think, okay, Republic falls, Empire rises, rebels destroy Empire, New Republic formed, boom. You know?
So it's
Galactic
complete.
War.
Well, because when I think of Star Wars, I think of like, it's a really well thought out world with like, moisture farming on a desert planet. I wouldn't have thought of that you would need to farm water from inside of a sand planet.
Are you asking me what makes Star Wars Star Wars, or what?
I'm asking you because like, I could read a medieval story or a real story that has a complete story in it. But what makes you look at a book and look at a Star Wars book or a movie and a Star Wars movie and choose the Star Wars one? What makes you choose to watch, read, or play that?
The characters, the world, the storyline. I think it has a very unique storyline.
It does.
Who has Jedi with the Force? And in fact, they actually made up their own language and their own, explanation for things and their own rules. But not only that, but someone cloned billions and billions of one single person, genetically altered like 3 different ways in an army. I mean, who thinks of that? And then someone with a criminal mastermind that is willing to sit and wait for years. I mean, Anakin was 10 years old?
Yeah.
He waited 10 years.
Just for Anakin to show up on the scene.
Just for Anakin to show up, and then another 10 years almost for, the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. Who sits for 10 years? I'm not even that patient. Come on. I'm not even that patient when I have to, thaw out, ground beef for you. I mean, I am not that patient. I want it, and I want it now.
I think for me, it's a mixture because I know every story is sort of a remix of pre-existing stories. You've got fantasy elements with space wizards and magic. You've got science fiction. You've got politics. You've got all this stuff, and it's existed before, but it's put in this thing where, you were saying, Boba Fett and Jango Fett are interesting characters that could exist on their own, and Palpatine's rise is a story that could be told on its own. And the Skywalker family and smugglers and the Mandalorians and their politics and the warrior culture, all of these things are really cool ideas mixed in with really cool visuals that were way ahead of their time. Industrial Light and Magic, a special effects company, was founded because no one could do what they needed to do for those first movies. And, they pushed the limits of what movie making is now. And then you top it all off with that perfect sound, because even if me and you don't like the same Star Wars movie, we can all pretty much agree that every Star Wars movie has great music.
True, and you know what else makes the prequel interesting and sets it apart from the other 3? At the end of those 3, the bad guys win.
That's true.
Bad guys win.
And it's something...
Not just a shootout, but the whole freaking galaxy. They win it all. It's the ultimate gamble, and, full house, I win. And
me and you noticed this because we rewatched the Clone Wars whenever they were re-airing, and then we followed it up immediately with Episode 3, and everything that happens in that final movie, as an adult man, I was watching this, and I had just gone on this journey for, weeks of rewatching the series aimed at children, and I cared enough about these characters that I was getting teared up watching a movie that I'd seen a million times, and it still connected with me. I was like, all of these good people were trying to do the right thing, and they never got a chance to, and it breaks your heart.
Or better yet, I mean, when you watch... Spoiler for anyone who has not seen the end of Season 7 of Clone Wars, stop right now. Because I'm going to tell you.
The bad guys win.
Well, at the end of Season 7, you see Order 66 basically from the perspective of the clones. And it's just as heartbreaking as seeing it in Star Wars Episode 3 and watching all these Jedi get shot down. These clones were people that they didn't have a choice to start with to be in this war. And they didn't have a choice for anything, It's heartbreaking because you see these clones all just also being slaughtered all the time throughout all the Clone Wars. They come up with their own names, their own personalities.
They have tattoos and armor paintings.
Yeah, they're people, and to sit there and watch massacres of them, and then even at the end where it's okay, these good people who didn't have a choice, who I was personally rooting for half the time, just, becoming mindless machines in the end. And it's just heartbreaking to watch that happen, especially when you follow one specific clone for 7 seasons, to watch him have to sit there and bury everyone else. It's awful. And, it shows you the journey they go on, and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, and to sort of close it all out, I know that I was watching some interviews with the people who designed, the clone armor and a lot of the stormtroopers, and they said that they were shocked that military personnel really gravitated towards the clones and the stormtroopers even, because you can look at something and know objectively that they're serving the bad guy, but having been a grunt in the military, when you see a bunch of people endlessly throwing themselves in danger with the idea that it makes the world better, it's hard not to sort of emotionally connect with that. And, you are doing similar things. You're training, you're sweating, you're suffering for the idea that other people won't have to. And that's something that's really interesting about even a lot of the stormtroopers, is they're hit with propaganda and they're told that what they're doing is saving the day, or it's the only real option they have because they live on a backwater planet. And even Luke was trying to join the Imperial Navy to become a TIE fighter pilot, which would have been a very interesting Elseworld story that I'm sure someone has cooked up at some point.
Okay. Solo.
But whenever I look at like the clone troopers and the stormtroopers and even the First Order troopers, who, this will catch me a lot of flack, but I genuinely think the First Order trooper design is actually one of the best Star Wars designs in the entirety of the whole universe, canon and non-canon. I think it's just a beautiful distillation of previous works that are in that, and I think a lot of that comes from the guy who has been designing everything since pretty much the prequels forward. That guy was involved in it.
I like the fin on the top of the Clone War armor, the original.
Yeah, the Phase 1 armor is kind of my favorite.
Not only that, but I think that their sight is better, from what
Yeah.
I've been actually told by someone who has replicated several helmets or owned them. I watched a video on YouTube, I don't remember their name, so shout out to them if they ever see this, but it was hysterical because he was tried on every single one. He goes, honestly, that's the only one I could actually see anything out of.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, because you have like basically a visor all the way opening all the way across. Everything else is a tiny little eye hole.
I think something that George was way ahead of his time on was he was showing war, and even the bad guys had good people who were doing bad things with the right intentions, or they were fighting for the wrong cause because they thought it was right, and they had people who were on the good side, you know, objectively or from a certain point of view, who were doing it for the wrong reasons or who took things too far. And in real life, that is what happens. You see it take a toll on real people, and poor choices be made because there's adrenaline and fear and patriotism. And as a kid, I was completely unaware, and then I revisit as an adult, and I see all these very mature things that I can be like, that is so true, that's so right, that it isn't just good and evil, black and white. There's a lot of very good and bad people on both sides that are just in situations that pit them against one another, when in reality, in a different life, they may have had way more in common and even been friends. And so I find that an element of it that really pulls me all back. And I'll sort of finish this off by saying that you as a woman have impacted my life in such a way, and the way that, you know, when you get married, you change, you pick up each other's habits, and you sort of form a new rhythm working around one another as, oh, I like to wake up at this time, I like to take a shower in the night instead of the morning, and you just sort of learn to dance around one another and make it more cohesive and well run. And you've helped me with creative work. You got me into writing, which turned into this. You've got me into like reading more. You've kind of made me a more educated man who can express himself and articulate what he's feeling, which when I got out of the military, I was basically a caveman who didn't understand why he was sad and angry all the time. So I credit you with a lot of that, and I'm actually working on a short story that I may never release except for just me and you, that is about a relentless TIE fighter pilot who is deadly dedicated to what they're doing and very like clockwork perfect, chasing after a rebel, and they're both stranded, and they're, even after their ships are both wrecked on this middle of nowhere place where they're the only sentient beings there and it's just savagery, she is still pursuing him to fight, and he is still trying to survive, and eventually they see how much they have in common, and they end up, you know, that sort of deconstructs why they're enemies, and you get to see sort of them both understanding why one another became what they did, and sort of only being able to survive because of one another. And then I'm thinking about, I don't want to give it all away, but they're given a chance to sort of return to who they were, and they're faced with that decision, both of them, and they may not come to the same conclusion of whether or not this harmony is the best route or if they're going to fall back on their old ways. But that character is very much influenced by you, although she's a little bit, you know, colder and meaner, because you're a very polite and wonderful person who spends her days taking care of people, not just me. But I just thought, you know, it was an idea I'd been kicking around, and it wasn't until I met you and I got to understand how you work that I kind of got in the mind of someone else, and I had enough of the characterization to make someone like that. So you have inspired me not only to take on multiple mediums, but you help me write the characters in my stories. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Also, you were smoking hot, which is a nice bonus. Anyway, this has been the Poppycock Podcast, where we talk about a lot of silly things. I am thankful for my greatest guest, and of course the loud dog Roxy, who in the background has been chasing laser lights and whining and meowing like a cat to try and get our attention because she's terrible at being a dog.
Oh, yeah.
That's what happens when you adopt a street dog. She never had a litter, so she just learned from whatever animals were around. Thank God it wasn't like a rabbit or like a rooster.
Those.
Well, imagine if she woke up at the crack of dawn and tried to cock-a-doodle-doo.
No, she used to wake up when we first got her at the crack of dawn, when I'd get up early for my other job at like 5, 6 o'clock. And
well, now we exercise her enough that she sleeps better. But yeah. She's my constant co-host, but you're my co-host for life.
No.
All right, well, we hope you had a good time listening, and remember, it's a bunch of stories meant for children, so even if you don't like it, let's not get too upset. It's all fictional. You can just pretend it didn't happen.
Be polite.
But also, The Last Jedi was...